Our daily life relies on computers, mobile devices, and the internet. Communication, transportation, online banking, entertainment, medicine, shopping, and many more aspects of our lives depend on the internet. But hidden hurdles are waiting for us out there. Cybercriminals, ready to attack. This is where cybersecurity comes into play. Cybersecurity encompasses all the means and techniques to protect the devices we use, the services we access, and our personal data from unauthorized digital access, damage, or theft. In the real world, we are surrounded by threats, be they accidental, like a storm, a car accident, or a fire, for instance, or intentional, a burglary, a physical attack, or even a war.
Good evening. Close to 200 firefighters are still battling a dangerous factory inferno.
Well, it was absolutely unlike anything I've ever experienced before.
We can take preventative measures against most of them, but not all. The same is true in the cyber world, and cybercriminals know how to use the remaining digital vulnerabilities to attack us. To develop a secure computing system, we use a set of 4 techniques that target the possible causes of security failures, simply called faults. These techniques are: fault prevention enables us to prevent the occurrence or introduction of faults. Fault tolerance allows us to deliver correct service in the presence of faults. Fault removal reduces the number or severity of faults. Fault forecasting makes it possible to estimate the present number, the future incidents, and the likely consequences of faults.
So cybersecurity is typically seen as a preventive measure, doing whatever we can in order to prevent bad things from happening, preventing a hacker to come into our system. So we want to protect our data, the services, the applications, and so on and so forth. But cybersecurity is more general than that. It's not only preventing, it's also all the techniques we need in order to tolerate this intrusion in case they happen. It's also about being able to remove whatever vulnerability or whatever attacker we have in the system once they get in, and more generally also continuously assessing the current state of security, the level of security that we have. So it's about prevention, about tolerance, about removing the bad things, and also about continuously assessing. So all these 4 means are what we need in order to make a secure system.
In the 60s and 70s, the theoretical foundations of the Internet were established with the invention of packet switching networks, Ethernet, and the Internet working principles defined by Vinton Cerf and Robert Kahn. In 1969, the first network, called the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, or ARPANET, is created, linking only a couple of machines for experimental validation purposes. The 80s can be seen as the birth of the Internet era. This is the decade when most of today's protocols are defined. On January 1st, 1983, the so-called Flag Day TCP/IP is introduced within the ARPANET. This marks the birth of the Internet as we know it today. The commercialization era begins in the 90s. Enterprises are allowed to connect to the Internet, which can be used for commercialization purposes and not only for scientific ones anymore. HTTP is invented. The 2000s constitute the World Wide Web era. A myriad of companies that emerged from the internet bubble have morphed over the years to become today's internet. The mobility of devices enabled by 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G networks empowered this process. At the beginning, in the 80s and 90s, viruses were a plague. The first virus, commonly known as elk cloner, is created in 1982. 4 years later, in 1986, appears Brain, the first virus to be widely deployed. The first viruses used to spread with floppy disks. As networks became more prevalent, viruses started spreading through network protocols. In the early 2000s, viruses gave way to bots. Hackers find ways to spread viruses, worms, and other malware extremely fast over the internet and use the compromised machines to support their malicious actions. The notions of armies of bot machines, or botnet, is born. They are, up to this day, the main instrument to run cyber attacks. Starting from the late 2000s until today, we are witnessing the professionalization era. Hackers are now interested in money, and they provide specialized paying services to each other. A complex underground ecosystem emerges as a mix of large and small professional hacking organizations, as well as nation-sponsored groups.
So in my team, we are working on different research axes that are all related to network security. In theory, we don't need to work in network security because in the security community, we believe that when you want to have a machine communicating to another machine, the security has to be only built by these two machines. So you do what is called end-to-end security. They authenticate each other and then they encrypt everything between the two. So whatever happens in the middle, we don't really care. That's the theory, and that's the way good systems should be built. But in practice, this is not the same. In theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. And that's what I focus on. It's the real networks, the way they're really built. And along with this idea in mind, we are working on 4 different research axes. So the first research axis has to do with what is called IoT, Internet of Things, all these gadgets that we are now buying at home. And of course, every user is eager to get the new device, unbox it, plug it in the wall, and have it to work. He doesn't want to worry about configurations and so on and so forth. Usability is the key element. And usability and security usually don't go very well hand in hand. And in particular, nowadays, with all these new gadgets, the way they auto-configure themselves is extremely insecure. So it is very easy for an attacker who would have access to the network to actually do really bad things. So we need, because we cannot modify those products, they are what they are, and of course we can claim that's not the right way of doing, but what we want to do is work on stuff that can actually have impact. And so if you cannot fix, then at least you want to be able to detect when bad things are happening. So we need to model the normal behavior, so to speak, of your network with all your gadgets and make sure that they are doing what they are supposed to do and only what they are supposed to do, and not spy on you, for instance, or not be used to store illicit material without you knowing, and so on and so forth. The second axe of research is somehow similar to the first one, but it has to deal with what is called OT technology. So the network that you and I are using are called IT networks, information technology networks, because we focus on information. OT technology, OT networks, for operational technology networks, they have to do with the manufacturing plant, the critical infrastructure, the electrical grid, the power plant, even the smart buildings. All these networks where actually you connect cyber-physical systems, so pump, valves, elevators, temperature sensors, actuators, elevators, all these physical devices. And unfortunately, those networks have been built, quite a while ago for the first one, like 15 years sometimes or more, and they rely on underlying technology that are notoriously unsecure. And again, these systems exist. They were usually isolated from the rest of the world, but for many reasons, and one of them being, the trend for big data, these systems now need to be opened and need to be connected to the internet. And that creates an attack surface which is growing. That means there are opportunities for bad people. And so again, this is an element where if you want to protect the system, you cannot necessarily modify it, because you are not going to change completely a building or an automotive factory. So what you have to do is to model, again, the way those devices talk to each other. But there the problem is that something that can look natural at the network level might be very different, might be actually a problem if you understand the physical process that is happening on the top. There is a so-called semantic gap between what you observe in the network and the consequences at the physical layer. So things may look normal at the network layer, but because of the specific mode of functioning at that time, it might be a bad command that has been sent. So there is an additional complexity problem that comes with the fact of reconciliating those two abstraction level. So that's another axis of research which has to do with the security of operational technology networks. So the third research axis has to do with gaming. And then I guess some of you may say, oh, gaming, that's cool. Yeah, that's actually cool indeed. And more specifically with those games that are massively distributed, that are distributed systems, complicated distributed systems. And as you may know, the gaming industry is really booming. It's an emerging business which is already bigger than the movie industry. And some of you who play know that if you get better and better and better, you will have access to different kinds of competitions and championship, and up to a point where you can really become a professional player. And there are sites where you can actually even pay just to watch people playing. So there is a lot of money at stake. And whenever you have money, you have fraud. You have people who try to cheat. So the gaming industry is targeted by and is the subject of many different kinds of security problems. So you have the people cheating, be it in terms of software, be it in using hardware, or sometimes they also manipulate the network protocols around them. But you also have issues with malware attacking your PC where the game is, so that they can actually steal some of the goods that you have acquired during your game. You have also some people misusing the gaming infrastructure to do money laundering. You have also a plague which has to do with people launching denial of services against the player, so that they, without being able to have access to the network, they cannot play, and then they lose the game they are involved in. So this is actually a major problem which has appeared a couple of years ago and which is growing, and we are also looking into that from different angles. The last research axis is kind of orthogonal to the three first ones. So I have explained that typically we should do end-to-end security, and we should not really worry about what happens in the network. But the reality is that there are a number of elements in the network that may interfere with that connections. And there is a need for us to really understand if indeed there is something happening in the network that could modify the connection that we have when it's not encrypted, or even in some cases when it is encrypted. So in order to do that, we are working on a new way to actually test the network, test its component, by having the server and the client and the server sending packets to each other in a kind of weird way. They add a bit of information kind of hidden. They add what we call some fingerprinting to their packets. And if those fingerprints do not arrive the way they have been sent at the server level, that means that something somewhere in the middle has modified the packet, and without knowing that there was this fingerprint and without being able to reproduce that fingerprint. And if you do that a certain amount of times in a smart ways with different kinds of fingerprint, then you might be able to identify what kind of device is interfering with your connection and potentially putting you in danger, and also where it is. So this can be used to, for instance, to understand if at home your network is not working. If you had this technology, it could help you to debug, to understand what the problem is, where it is. Is it at home? Is it your ISP? Is it somewhere else? It can also be used to verify that if you are in a network that is supposed to be protected by some device, you want to make sure that those devices are working properly, and that system could actually tell you that. But it could also help you to verify that when you're talking to a remote machine, there is indeed nothing in between which is interfering, watching, modifying whatever you are sending to the other side. And so, and that is the idea of this research, is to really build a completely distributed platform with machines all around the world through a mechanism of open source for the software, so that other contributors could actually also add their IDs to that framework. So these are the research axes we work on in my team. I know that network security and networking in general is usually seen and taken for granted, like a commodity, like water, electricity. You have networking. But in fact, it is much more complicated than that. And network security, there are lots of open issues that we have to work. There are lots of opportunities for very interesting research, and research with a very high impact. And we definitely need more people to come and work with us on that topic.